They didn't leave because you were too little. They left because you were too much, too honest in a world that wears masks, too loyal in a time that romanticizes convenience, too deep for people still swimming in shallow waters. And while you stood there, wondering what you did wrong, the truth was simpler and far more painful. They were never ready for someone like you. You didn't scare them with your flaws. You scared them with your light. Because your presence whispered truths their silence couldn't bury. That's why they disappeared. That's why they ran, not from your weakness, but from your strength. You were too much for their emptiness. You walked into their lives, carrying more than they knew how to handle. Not gifts or promises, but presence, wholeness, a sense of self that had been shaped in silence, carved through trials and polished by heartbreak. And the moment they met you, they knew, on some wordless, trembling level, that they were not equipped to meet you at that depth. Not because you demanded too much, but because you simply existed without pretending. You didn't need to wear a disguise to feel safe. You didn't play games to be wanted. You just showed up as you. And that was enough to unsettle everything hollow inside them. Because when emptiness meets fullness, it panics. It feels threatened, not because it hates the light, but because it doesn't understand it. You were the quiet storm in their world of noise. They could feel the weight of your truth, even if they couldn't name it. And in a place where people chase attention but run from intimacy, you stood like a mirror, and that was more than they could bear. They were used to temporary people, interactions that never left a mark. They knew how to dance with masks, how to keep everything surface level so no one ever saw the truth. But you looked through the noise. You heard what they didn't say. You didn't fall for their performance. You reached for the soul beneath it, and that terrified them, because when you've lived your life building walls, someone who walks in without trying to tear them down, but simply sees through them, is too much. So they distanced themselves. They ghosted, they drifted, they shut down, not because they didn't feel something, but because they felt everything all at once and didn't know what to do with it. They'll never admit it. They'll never say, "You made me realize how empty I feel inside." But their silence screamed it, their withdrawal confessed it, and their absence etched it into your memory like a scar that kept whispering, "You were too much." But the truth is, you were only too much for those who had too little to give. And that's not a flaw in you, that's a fact about them. They weren't bad people, just unready ones. And the worst thing you can do is punish yourself for showing up with a full heart in a world that often only has fragments to offer. Some people don't leave because you were wrong for them. They leave because you made them see they were wrong for themselves. And that's a weight they're not willing to carry. So no, you weren't abandoned because you lacked. You were abandoned because you revealed. And when people live in the comfort of their numbness, anything that wakes them up feels like an earthquake. You were not a mistake. You were a reminder, and reminders aren't always welcomed, especially by those who are still hiding from what they don't want to feel. You reflected their hidden truths. You didn't just enter their life. You exposed it. Without trying, without forcing, just by being yourself. You became a mirror they never asked for, but couldn't escape. And that mirror didn't show them the version of themselves they liked to perform for the world. It showed them the raw, unfinished, aching parts they spent years avoiding. You didn't criticize them, you didn't shame them, but your presence, honest, grounded, unfiltered, unveiled the truth they kept buried under charm, distraction, and control. You didn't point at their wounds, but you made them visible simply by standing in your own healing. And for people who've built their identity on running from their pain, that's more terrifying than any confrontation. Because it wasn't what you said, it was what you didn't need to say. You weren't trying to fix them, you were just real, and realness in a world addicted to illusion is dangerous. They may have smiled, they may have praised you, they may have even claimed to admire your strength, but deep down your light made their shadows louder. The way you spoke with clarity, the way you stayed calm in chaos, the way you refused to betray yourself to be liked. It was foreign to them. And foreign things are unsettling when someone hasn't learned to welcome truth. So rather than rise to your level, rather than let your authenticity inspire growth, they quietly turned away, not because you wounded them, but because your very existence made them feel seen. And they weren't ready to be seen. They abandoned you not to hurt you, but to protect the illusion they were clinging to. You became the reminder of everything they postponed, their honesty, their accountability, their healing. You became the proof that it's possible to survive and still keep your heart open. And for someone who's spent their life surviving by shutting their heart down, that is confronting. They didn't leave you. They escaped themselves through you. You were just the door they used to run from the reflection in the glass. The pain of abandonment often whispers, "What did I do wrong?" But sometimes that pain is actually a compliment in disguise. Because only someone with depth can awaken the parts others have numbed. Only someone whole can accidentally shine light on what others are still hiding. And when that happens, people have two choices: evolve or retreat. They chose to retreat, not because you weren't enough, but because you were the first person to ever make them feel seen without speaking. So don't regret being that mirror. Don't regret standing in truth when others chose denial. Your reflection wasn't the problem. Their fear of facing it was. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can ever do is to let someone walk away from your truth, knowing deep down it will follow them long after you're gone. You broke their illusion of control. They wanted you to bend, to mold, to compromise, not in the name of love, but in the name of control. They didn't seek connection. They sought dominance disguised as affection. And when you didn't play along, when you held your ground without raising your voice, something inside them fractured, because you weren't rebellious. You were immovable. You didn't fight for power, but you refused to be handled. And that, to someone who builds relationships on control, is the ultimate threat. You weren't loud, you didn't beg, you didn't manipulate. You simply stood in your truth and said without words, "I will not shrink to be kept." That is the kind of strength that breaks illusions. Control thrives in the presence of insecurity. People who fear vulnerability try to dominate what they can't understand. And you, so calm, so clear, so inwardly anchored, were not easily moved. You didn't chase. You didn't fall for silent treatments, guilt trips, or praise turned into pressure. You were open, yes, but not naive, and they couldn't handle the fact that you saw through the act. You saw the games for what they were. You recognized the subtle power plays hiding behind smiles and sweet words. You didn't resist to be difficult. You resisted because your self-respect was not negotiable. And here's what terrified them most. You never needed them. You chose them, and someone who is chosen rather than needed cannot manipulate their way into staying. They couldn't guilt you into submission. They couldn't twist your empathy into compliance. They couldn't use your kindness as a weapon against you. Because even in your love you had boundaries, and that was the storm they never saw coming. So they left, abruptly or gradually, maybe with silence, maybe with blame, but underneath it all, they left because their illusion of power crumbled in your presence. They weren't losing a relationship. They were losing control over a person they couldn't shape. And for some, that feels like loss. Even when love is still on the table, your strength didn't destroy them. It exposed them. It reminded them that real love doesn't come with strings, and real connection doesn't demand that one person shrink for the other to feel secure. They weren't ready for someone who knew their worth without shouting it. They weren't ready for a heart that loved deeply, but didn't beg to be understood. And when they realized they couldn't outplay you, couldn't outmaneuver you, couldn't mold you, they chose distance over depth. Because distance is easier than growth. Distance doesn't require change, but let this be clear. You weren't abandoned because you were stubborn. You were left because you couldn't be tamed. And in a world where too many are used to controlling love, Your freedom was a language they never learned to speak. You offered depth in a shallow age. You spoke in a language that this era is slowly forgetting. Depth. While the world danced in distractions, obsessed with appearances, speed and applause, you moved differently. You asked real questions. You paused before you spoke. You listened, not just to words, but to what was hidden beneath them. You noticed, you remembered. You didn't just want connection. You wanted truth. And in an age where people fear silence because it might reveal what's missing inside, you offered presence, stillness, meaning. And though they may have smiled, leaned in, and acted like they wanted that too, the truth is, your depth was foreign, intimidating, and ultimately, it demanded more than they were willing to give. You didn't ask for a performance. You weren't chasing charm or perfection. You were searching for soul, for roots, not just flowers. But people have grown comfortable skating across surfaces, keeping things light, digestible, marketable. So when you showed up without a mask, without filters, offering something real, it made them hesitate, because depth calls forth reflection, and reflection often pulls up what people have worked very hard to bury. You weren't trying to confront them. You were just being honest. But even honesty can feel like a threat in a culture built on pretense. You spoke of healing, not drama, of growth, not gossip. You weren't interested in winning arguments. You were interested in understanding. That made you different, rare, and sadly, rare things are often mishandled by those who are only used to the ordinary. You wanted emotional courage, not convenience. And that was too heavy for someone still chasing quick fixes and easy escapes. They weren't ready to meet themselves, and being around you meant they'd have to. They were drawn to your depth, yes. It fascinated them. It made them feel seen, perhaps for the first time. But fascination is not the same as readiness. You can love how a mountain looks without being prepared to climb it. You can admire the ocean without knowing how to swim, and that's what happened. They admired your depth, but couldn't breathe in it. So they returned to shallow waters, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't yet know how to stay afloat in something so real. And now you might sit wondering why they vanished, why someone who once leaned in suddenly pulled away. But the truth is this: you didn't lose them. You simply revealed what they were never ready to give. You didn't scare them with pressure. You scared them with possibility. The possibility that love could be more. That intimacy could be healing, not just entertaining. That silence could be sacred, not awkward. And they weren't prepared for that kind of awakening. You weren't abandoned because you lacked anything. You were left because you offered something too many are no longer taught to value. Substance over spectacle. And in a time where connection is often just performance, your sincerity was the rarest gift of all. You loved without a mask. You didn't play a role. You didn't act lovable. You simply loved, with your flaws visible, with your heart exposed, with your intentions clear. You didn't edit it yourself to become more acceptable. You didn't study what they liked just to become it. You didn't perform affection. You offered it freely and without condition. And in a world trained to put on masks to feel safe, that kind of honesty is disarming. You loved not to impress, not to control, not to win, but because love to you was never a strategy. It was who you were. And when someone meets that kind of love before they're ready to receive it, they don't always hold it. They run from it, because love without a mask asks for love in return without disguise. It demands presence, vulnerability, and truth, and not everyone can give that. Not everyone wants to stand unguarded in the light of real affection. Many prefer the comfort of distance disguised as independence, or attraction disguised as attention. But you didn't give them the version of love they were used to. You didn't offer the chase, the confusion, or the chaos they had learned to call passion. You offered something softer, and yet stronger, the kind of love that doesn't rush but stays, the kind that listens, that forgives, that holds space without demanding control, and to someone unfamiliar with safety, that can feel strangely unsafe. They may have said you were intense, too emotional, too open, but what they really meant was, you didn't pretend, and I didn't know how to meet you there, because meeting you there would mean lowering the mask. And not everyone is ready to show who they are beneath the performance. Some have worn their roles for so long they no longer know where the act ends and the truth begins. You didn't expose them with words. You exposed them with love. And when someone is used to love being conditional, manipulative, or transactional, they don't always trust the kind that just is. So they left, not because you were too much, but because you were too real. You didn't flatter their ego, you touched their soul, and touching a soul requires that the soul be open, ready, awake, and many aren't. Many are still hiding behind curated identities, behind walls of humor, silence, sarcasm, or strength. You didn't just see the mask. They felt you saw the person behind it, and that was too intimate for someone still in hiding. But never regret loving that way. Never regret the rawness of your heart or the courage it took to love without armor. Because the love you gave wasn't wasted. It planted something, even in the soil that seemed unwilling. One day, maybe long after you're gone, they'll remember it, not as weakness, not as naivety, but as something they wish they'd understood sooner. Because loving without a mask isn't foolish. It's rare, and you were rare. That's why they left.